Hey church, we are back again for part 2 in how to do an effective inductive Bible study on your own. And we had talked about the 3 different steps, 3 simple steps: observation, interpretation, and application. The last video we talked about observation. What does the text say? This one we're going to be talking about interpretation, right? And so that's the fun one. Everybody likes to get to the interpretation. So you'll notice with me I have not only Puppy on the back, which is Donovan. Say hello to Donovan. We also have Bella. And Bella's being camera shy, so we won't include her. Bella is a very needy dog and the mother of this one, and so she doesn't like to be left out, and she wanted to be here. So that being said, the 3 of us will share with you stage 2 of how to do an inductive Bible study. This is interpretation. We're asking ourselves, what does the text mean? So in the observation phase, like we said, we're just seeing what is it all about. We're looking for, like Jack Webb in the series Dragnet, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts, right? Now we're getting into the interpretation, but we need to be cautious about this. Peter says in his word that no text of Scripture is open to private interpretation. It's actually the interpretation comes from old. It comes from the text. We don't need to make the text say anything, and that's not what interpretation is about. Interpretation is looking at what it actually is saying. And the most important thing you can remember is that all Scripture has an interpretation it's built into it. It's a cultural interpretation. What did it really mean to the first listeners or the first readers of this particular passage? If you can't have an answer for that, then you don't know what it means. If you're trying to only put it into what it means to us today in 21st century America, then you don't understand what the text means. So you need to make sure that when you're reading this, you're not reading it from your own cultural milieu. So now we're looking at what does the text mean? What can we draw out of this? At this stage, your job is trying to figure out, again, what the author is trying to communicate. What did Jesus really mean to his audience? Because remember, if the meaning is unintelligible to the original hearers, then it's going to be unintelligible, period. It never would have been included. It has to be intelligible to the original listeners, the original people that were there. If it wasn't there, then anything you're reading into it's wrong. Okay? So ask yourself some of these questions, like, what is the cultural or historical context of the passage? A good study Bible will help you do this, looking back at who wrote it, what the purpose of the book was, where what was the time frame. Was this written in AD 30, 70? Was it written just after the destruction of Jerusalem? Was it written before the Israelites went into bondage in Egypt? Was it written before they went to Babylon? These are questions you need to ask yourself, because it allows you to house and put the passage into its right historical and cultural context. What do you know about the author? What do you know about the book? What is the broader concepts that are there? You might also want to think about what if there's other passages of Scripture. A good study Bible will usually have little notations in the margins as to passages of Scripture where this concept was talked about before or at other times, and it allows you the opportunity to look. So feel free to, during this time of your investigation, to allow your mind to wander to other areas. Look, if you're in Mark, the first chapter, and you notice you're reading something in Mark and you're wondering, why did Jesus say this? And there's a little letter or a number next to a word or next to that particular verse, and in the margin it says Isaiah 43:30. We'll go and look and see what it says in Isaiah 43:30, because it's important to know that. In the last video, we talked about making a list of words that are repeated, right? Look at those words that are repeated. Ask yourself, where else in Scripture are those words mentioned? Okay? And then ask yourself, am I making any assumptions to this? Always question your own assumptions. Assumptions are built upon previous sermons, previous readings, previous understandings, if you will. And a lot of times we can get trapped into these presuppositions, these assumptions that we bring into the text, and that's not good. So we need to make sure that we're reading this with fresh eyes. What is the clearest meaning of the text? Sometimes Occam's razor says that sometimes the simplest answer is the right answer. And that's sometimes what we have to do. But don't always jump to the simplest answer, because sometimes God does throw his curveballs in his scripture. There are times that he will talk about one thing, but know that his discussion is going to bleed into other areas, and he does that on purpose to force us to study and to show ourselves approved. Okay. There are some other things that we need to remember as we're going through this. Like, we shouldn't twist the meaning of Scripture. We don't want to manipulate it to say anything that we want it to. And we need to ask ourselves, are we doing that? Let Scripture interpret Scripture. Allow the Bible itself to help you understand other passages. So like I was saying, don't twist the Scripture. Don't manipulate the meaning. We don't want to try to make the text say something that we want it to say. That's the wrong way to do it. We look for the simplest and plainest interpretation first, and then and simply believe what the text says and allow that to bring us to a better place. Now, I know some of you are saying, well, Pastor, we've sat through your studies and you don't always do that. You're right, because I start with the plainest interpretation and I look for what that means, and then I try to line that up with what I understand Scripture to mean as a total. Because sometimes the plainest first glance, first blush interpretation isn't what God is trying to bring out to us, because that first plain interpretation doesn't line up with the overall biblical doctrine of whatever it is you're trying to study. But you start with the obvious, and then you move beyond that. You don't stay with the obvious. You start there and then move on. So allow Scripture to interpret Scripture. One of the other things we need to do is avoid basing important doctrines on obscure passages. You see that often in cults and other things, other groups that preach heresy. They will oftentimes take a small or a single verse and then build an entire theology around it, rather than let the totality of the Bible develop the doctrine. And this is something that is always a challenge when we start studying Scripture, is we'll find something that's so amazing and it's a truth that we just want to revolutionize our life with, but we have to be careful not to base anything that we do on a single passage of Scripture. Allow all of, like, for instance, salvation. Salvation is not based on a single thing that Jesus said. He said numerous things about salvation all the way through his life, and during that time, he would make these statements about salvation. And so after that, his apostles then began to teach the same concepts, using his words in a later text as they defined it and fleshed it out. And so we take all what the apostles say and what Jesus said, we marry them together, and we can have a very good understanding of what it means to be saved. And so I think these are the things that we need to make sure that we do. This is the bulk in the three phases, the three steps. You're going to spend the bulk of your time in the interpretation phase. And so when you just about the time you think you have an understanding of a passage, begin to compare it to other parts of Scripture that talk about the same thing. And you can do this with a good dictionary, an expositor's dictionary, as you begin to look at what the meanings of some of these words are, and they'll give you passages of Scripture where this concept is talked about as well. And as you begin to flesh that out, you can sort of compare your understanding of this passage with the broader understanding of some of the other passages. And if you're off base, maybe it means that you're not connected with the true meaning of the passage. It could mean that some of the people that have read it in the past are not connected to the true meaning of the passage. So don't immediately throw out your first assumptions. Run with them until they are completely ripped apart by the totality of Scripture, or reinforced one way or the other, you'll find the truth of it. So again, make sure you take a good time, spend a good deal of time in this particular phase as you are observing and trying to be as honest as you can before you move on to the final stage, which is application. Because you can't apply a passage of Scripture to your life unless you fully understand it. Otherwise, you're going to apply it in the wrong way. So again, thank you for this stage. We look forward to talking to you the next part 3, where we're going to do the final stage of application.